The last ranger to walk the trails of Camp Evergreen was a man named Thomas Whitfield, and he disappeared on the morning of August 14, 1987. His truck was found at the main gate 3 days later, engine cold, keys still dangling from the ignition. The driver's side door hung open as if he had stepped out for just a moment, perhaps to investigate a sound from the treeline, perhaps to answer a voice that called to him from somewhere deep within the pines. His body was never recovered. The official report listed him as a missing person, case number 87 to 4421, but the unofficial story, the one whispered among the rangers who came after, the one scrawled in fading ink on the back pages of logbooks never meant for public eyes, told a different tale entirely. Camp Evergreen had been closed for 3 years by the time Thomas vanished. The cabins stood empty, their windows dark and watching. The mess hall had become a cathedral of dust and silence, its long wooden tables still set with tin plates and cups as if the campers might return at any moment. The lake had grown still and black, its surface unbroken by swimmers or canoes, reflecting only the gray sky and the darker shadows of the surrounding forest. Something had happened here in the summer of 1984, something that had emptied the camp of children and counselors alike, something that had driven the county to erect chain-link fences around the property and post warnings that trespassers would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But fences rust and warning signs fade, and the forest has a way of reclaiming what belongs to it. The story begins not with Thomas Whitfield, though his disappearance would later prove essential to understanding what lurked beneath Camp Evergreen. The story begins with a girl named Sarah Mendez, 11 years old, who arrived at the camp on June 3, 1984, with a duffel bag full of clothes her mother had packed and a journal her father had given her for the trip. She was a quiet child, prone to wandering, fond of the spaces between things, the gaps in conversations, the pauses in songs, the moments just before sleep when the world seemed to thin and shimmer at its edges. Her counselor, a college student named Rebecca Holt, noted in her first report that Sarah seemed distracted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The camp had operated continuously since 1952, founded by a man named Harold Evergreen who had made his fortune in timber and sawmills before the war. Harold had believed in the restorative power of nature, in the way fresh air and physical labor could shape young minds into something stronger and more resilient. He had built the camp with his own hands, or so the legend went, carved the main lodge from a single ancient oak, laid the foundation stones that still supported the cabins, dug the fire pit at the center of the clearing where generations of children would gather to sing songs and roast marshmallows and tell ghost stories they only half believed. Harold died in 1961, but his camp lived on, passing through a succession of owners who maintained its traditions while slowly modernizing its facilities. By 1984, Camp Evergreen could accommodate 200 children per session, with a staff of 40 counselors, cooks, maintenance workers and administrators. It was considered one of the finest summer camps in the state, a place where memories were made and friendships forged that would last a lifetime. Sarah's journal entries from her first week paint a picture of ordinary camp life, the kind of mundane details that take on terrible significance only in retrospect. She wrote about swimming lessons in the lake, about the cold shock of the water and the way the sun felt on her skin as she floated on her back and watched the clouds drift overhead. She wrote about the food in the mess hall, which she found bland but plentiful, and about the other girls in her cabin, who were friendly enough but seemed to exist in a world slightly removed from her own. She wrote about the counselors and their endless enthusiasm, about the crafts and the hikes and the campfire songs that everyone seemed to know the words to accept her. And then on the night of June 9th she wrote something else. I heard them tonight, she wrote in her careful looping script. The children in the woods. They were calling my name. Rebecca Holt found the entry the following morning during a routine cabin inspection. She brought it to the camp director, a woman named Margaret Chen, who read it with a frown that deepened as her eyes moved across the page. Children often had vivid imaginations, Margaret knew. They heard things in the night, owls and wind and the settling of old wooden buildings, and transformed them into monsters and ghosts and mysterious voices. It was part of the experience, part of what made summer camp such a formative environment. But something about Sarah's words troubled her in a way she could not quite articulate. Perhaps it was the specificity of the claim, the certainty with which Sarah stated that the voices had called her name. Perhaps it was the way the entry ended mid-sentence, as if Sarah had been interrupted by something, or as if she had simply stopped writing to listen. Margaret spoke with Sarah that afternoon, pulling her aside after lunch to have what she called a check-in chat. Sarah was polite and responsive, answering questions about her first week at camp with the careful thoughtfulness that characterized all her interactions. When Margaret asked about the journal entry about the voices in the woods, Sarah's expression did not change. She looked at Margaret with those dark, watchful eyes and said simply that she had heard children calling her name from somewhere among the trees. They sounded sad, she explained. They sounded lost. They wanted her to come find them. Margaret assured Sarah that there were no children in the woods, that the forest surrounding Camp Evergreen was uninhabited for miles in every direction. The nearest town was over an hour away by car, and the only access to the camp property was through a single gated road that was monitored around the clock. Whatever Sarah had heard, Margaret said gently, it must have been a dream or her imagination playing tricks on her in the dark. These things happened especially during the first few nights away from home. Sarah nodded and said she understood, but Margaret noticed that the girl's eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the wall of pines that bordered the camp clearing, as if she were watching for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows between the trees. The ranger logs from that period, maintained by a man named Douglas Trent who patrolled the Forest Service roads surrounding the camp property, contain their own troubling observations. On June 11, Douglas noted an unusual number of deer carcasses along the northern trail, their bodies stripped of flesh in a manner he had never before encountered. The bones were not gnawed or scattered as they would be if predators had been at work. Instead, they were arranged almost deliberately, laid out in patterns that seemed to follow the contours of the land. Douglas photographed the remains and submitted his report to the district office, where it was filed and forgotten. On June 13, he noted a strange silence in the eastern quadrant of the forest, an absence of birdsong and insect noise that made him uneasy in ways he struggled to describe. He wrote that the trees there seemed darker somehow, as if the sunlight could not penetrate their canopy, as if the shadows beneath them were thicker and more substantial than shadows had any right to be. By mid-June, 3 more children at Camp Evergreen had reported hearing voices in the night. A boy named Michael Torres, 9 years old, told his counselor that he had heard his mother calling to him from somewhere near the lake. His mother, he insisted, who was supposed to be at home in Milwaukee, who had no reason to be at Camp Evergreen, who had promised to pick him up at the end of the session. Another girl, Jennifer Oakes, 12 years old, claimed to have heard her younger brother crying in the woods behind her cabin. Her brother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, a fact that Jennifer had shared with no one at the camp, a fact that made her counselor's blood run cold when she finally disclosed it during a tearful late-night conversation. A third child, a boy whose name has been redacted from all surviving records, reported hearing a chorus of children singing somewhere deep in the forest, singing songs he did not recognize in voices that did not sound quite right, voices that stretched and wavered and broke apart at their edges like reflections in disturbed water. Margaret Chen called an emergency staff meeting on the night of June 16. She gathered her counselors in the main lodge after the children had been put to bed, and she told them what she had learned from her conversations with the affected campers. She asked if anyone else had noticed anything unusual, anything that might explain the sudden epidemic of auditory hallucinations spreading through the camp population. The counselors exchanged glances and slowly, reluctantly, they began to share their own experiences. Rebecca Holt admitted that she had heard something on the night of June 8, a child's voice calling from the treeline, a voice that had spoken her name so clearly and so sweetly that she had nearly stepped off the cabin porch to follow it before catching herself. Another counselor, a young man named David Park, confessed that he had been finding strange marks on the trees along his morning jogging route, deep grooves carved into the bark at regular intervals, grooves that looked almost like letters in an alphabet he did not recognize. The meeting ended without resolution. Margaret instructed her staff to maintain vigilance, to report any further incidents immediately, and to reassure the children that whatever they were experiencing was perfectly normal and nothing to be afraid of. She did not believe this, not entirely, but she knew that panic would serve no one. The camp would continue as planned. The children would swim and hike and sing around the campfire. And Margaret would begin making discreet inquiries into the history of the land on which Camp Evergreen had been built, into the stories that had been told about this place long before Harold Evergreen had driven his first stake into the soil and declared it fit for children. What she discovered in the weeks that followed would haunt her until her death. The Miwok people had called this valley Shawelo, which translated roughly to the place where the earth swallows. Their oral traditions, transcribed by ethnographers in the late 19th century and stored in archives that Margaret Chen would spend 3 sleepless nights examining, spoke of something that lived beneath the ground, something old and hungry and patient beyond human comprehension. The stories varied in their details. Some described the creature as a spirit, others as a demon, still others as a god of the deep places, but they agreed on its essential nature. It was a thing that fed on human flesh, that lured its prey with sounds and voices, that could mimic anything it had once consumed. The Miwok had learned to avoid the valley entirely, to steer their hunting parties around its borders, to warn their children never to follow a familiar voice into unfamiliar territory. When the white settlers came, the Miwok tried to warn them too, but their warnings were dismissed as superstition, as the fearful imaginings of a primitive people who had not yet learned to understand the natural world. The settlers built farms in the valley. The farms failed. The settlers built homes. The homes were abandoned. For nearly a century the land sat empty, passed from owner to owner, each one arriving with plans and ambitions and leaving with nothing but stories they refused to tell. Harold Evergreen was the first to make something last, and he did it by building his camp on the eastern edge of the valley, as far from its center as the property lines would allow. Margaret found a letter in the camp's archived files, a letter Harold had written to his wife in 1954, 2 years after the camp's founding. He wrote about a conversation he had had with an old Miwok woman, one of the last speakers of her language, who had come to the camp gates one afternoon to deliver a warning. She had told Harold about Shawelo, about the thing that lived beneath the valley floor, about the children it had taken over the centuries, children whose voices could still be heard on certain nights, calling to their families, begging to be found. Harold had listened politely and then sent her away. But he had moved the planned site of the new swimming pool from the western field to the eastern shore of the lake, and he had quietly discontinued the night hikes through the forest that had been a camp tradition since its first summer. Margaret shared none of this with her staff. She was not certain what she believed, not yet, and she knew that stories of ancient monsters and cursed land would only increase the anxiety that was already spreading through the camp like a fever. Instead, she implemented what she called enhanced safety protocols, measures she presented as routine updates to existing policies. Night supervision was increased. Cabin doors were to remain locked after lights out. Children were forbidden from entering the forest without adult accompaniment. The measures were accepted without question by most of the staff, who were grateful for any concrete action in the face of the nameless dread that had begun to permeate their daily routines. Only Rebecca Holt seemed troubled by the new restrictions, seemed to sense that Margaret was hiding something, but she kept her suspicions to herself and focused on caring for Sarah Mendez, who had grown increasingly withdrawn as the days passed. Sarah's journal entries from the second half of June are difficult to read. Her handwriting, once neat and careful, began to deteriorate, the letters growing jagged and uneven as if she were writing in great haste or under conditions of extreme distress. She no longer wrote about swimming lessons or craft projects or the other ordinary activities of camp life. Instead, she wrote about the voices. They came every night now, she explained, not just one voice but many, a chorus of children calling to her from the darkness beyond her cabin window. They knew her name. They knew her secrets. They told her things about herself that no one else could possibly know, things she had never shared with anyone, things she had barely acknowledged to herself. They wanted her to join them, they said. They wanted her to come into the forest and find them. They promised that if she did, she would never be alone again. Rebecca found Sarah standing at the treeline on the morning of June 22nd. She had slipped out of the cabin sometime before dawn, evading the counselor who was supposed to be watching the door, and walked the 200 yards from the sleeping quarters to the edge of the forest. She stood motionless, her bare feet sinking into the damp grass, her eyes fixed on something in the shadows between the pines. Rebecca called her name 3 times before Sarah responded, and when she finally turned around, her expression was utterly blank, emptied of all the quiet intelligence that had defined her since her arrival at the camp. She looked at Rebecca as if she did not recognize her, as if Rebecca were a stranger who had interrupted something private and important. Then she blinked and the light returned to her eyes and she began to cry. Sarah was placed on 24-hour supervision after the incident. A counselor was assigned to watch her at all times, to accompany her to every activity, to sleep in the bed next to hers and ensure that she did not leave the cabin again during the night. Margaret called Sarah's parents and suggested, as delicately as possible, that they might want to consider withdrawing their daughter from the program early. The Mendezes were concerned but not alarmed. Children often struggled with homesickness, they said. Children often had trouble adjusting to new environments. They asked Margaret to give Sarah another week, to let her find her footing, to trust that she would settle in eventually. Margaret agreed, against her better judgment, and hung up the phone with a feeling of dread that would prove entirely justified. The next 3 days passed without incident. Sarah attended her activities, participated in group discussions, and even smiled once or twice during a comedy skit performed by the counselors at the evening campfire. The other children who had reported hearing voices seemed to recover as well, their fears fading in the bright light of day, their nights growing quieter and less troubled. Margaret allowed herself to hope that whatever had been happening at Camp Evergreen was coming to an end, that the strange episode would become nothing more than an unsettling memory, a story to be told in whispered tones at future staff reunions. On June 26, a boy named Christopher Williams walked into the forest and did not return. Christopher was 7 years old, the youngest child at Camp Evergreen that summer. He was small for his age, quiet and serious, with a tendency to drift to the edges of groups and observe rather than participate. His counselor, a young woman named Amy Foster, had grown fond of him in the 3 weeks since his arrival. She found his solemnity endearing, his careful way of considering questions before answering them evidence of an intelligence that exceeded his years. She was the one who noticed his absence at lunch, who checked the cabin and the bathroom and the lake shore before raising the alarm, who stood in Margaret's office with tears streaming down her face and said that Christopher was gone, that she had taken her eyes off him for just a moment during morning activities, that she had looked away and when she looked back he was no longer there. The search began immediately. Every available staff member fanned out through the camp property, calling Christopher's name, checking every building and every hiding place where a small child might conceivably shelter. Margaret called the county sheriff and requested assistance, then called the ranger station and asked Douglas Trent to mobilize his colleagues for a sweep of the surrounding forest. By 3 o'clock, 40 people were searching for Christopher Williams. By 6 o'clock they had found nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no sign that he had ever entered the woods at all. The search continued through the night. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness between the trees, casting wild shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. Voices echoed through the forest, calling Christopher's name over and over until the syllables lost all meaning and became mere sounds, desperate and raw. Sarah Mendez listened from her cabin, her face pressed against the window glass, her breath fogging the view. She knew where Christopher had gone. She had heard the voices calling to him too, had heard them whispering his name in the moments before he disappeared. They had promised him something just as they had promised her. They had told him about a place where children lived forever, a place beneath the ground where no one could find them, where no one could hurt them, where they would never have to go home. She did not tell anyone what she knew. She was not certain they would believe her. She was not certain she believed herself. The search was called off at dawn on June 27. Christopher Williams was officially listed as a missing person, and the sheriff's department took over the investigation from the camp staff. Parents were notified, statements were taken, and the difficult decision was made to continue camp operations while the search expanded into the surrounding wilderness. Margaret argued against this, insisted that the camp should be evacuated until Christopher was found, but she was overruled by the county commissioners, who were concerned about liability and reputation and all the mundane considerations that seemed so desperately irrelevant in the face of a missing child. The children were told that Christopher had gone home early, that his parents had come to pick him up in the night, that there was nothing to worry about. Most of them accepted the explanation without question. A few did not. Sarah Mendez wrote in her journal that night that she could hear Christopher's voice now, calling from the forest along with all the others, calling her name, asking her to come and find him. Douglas Trent's ranger logs from this period contain observations that would later prove crucial to understanding what happened at Camp Evergreen. On June 28, he noted the discovery of a sinkhole in the forest approximately 1 mile northwest of the camp property, a hole perhaps 10 feet in diameter that had not appeared on any previous surveys of the area. He descended several yards into the opening before the smell drove him back, a smell he described as ancient and organic, like rotting vegetation mixed with something else, something he could not identify, something that made his stomach turn and his skin crawl. He reported the sinkhole to his supervisors and was told to mark it on his maps and avoid the area until a geological survey could be conducted. The survey was scheduled for August, 2 months away. By then it would be far too late. On June 30, Douglas found what remained of Christopher Williams. The body was located approximately 800 yards from the camp property, in a shallow depression near the base of an ancient redwood that had been growing in that spot for perhaps 1,000 years. Douglas had passed the area dozens of times during his patrols, had walked within feet of the depression without ever noticing anything unusual. But on that morning something drew his attention, a flash of color in his peripheral vision that should not have been there. He stepped off the trail and pushed through the underbrush and found himself looking down at a scene that would visit him in nightmares for the rest of his life. Christopher had been arranged rather than simply discarded. His small body lay on its back, arms crossed over his chest, legs straight and parallel. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the canopy above. His expression was peaceful, almost serene, as if he had simply laid down to rest and never woken up. But the condition of his remains told a different story entirely. His torso had been opened, not torn but separated along what appeared to be surgical lines, the flesh parted cleanly to expose the cavity beneath. His internal organs were missing: heart, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines. All of them extracted and taken away, leaving behind only the empty shell of ribs and spine and pale, bloodless tissue. There was no blood at the scene, not a single drop, as if Christopher had been exsanguinated elsewhere and brought to this place afterward, arranged in this grotesque tableau for reasons that defied comprehension. Douglas did not touch the body. He did not approach any closer than necessary to confirm what he had found. He radioed for assistance and then sat down on a fallen log and wept, his shoulders shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had been a ranger for 15 years. He had seen death before: hikers who had fallen from cliffs, hunters who had been attacked by bears, bodies of drowning victims pulled from rivers and lakes. But he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen a child arranged like an offering, hollowed out like a sacrifice, laid at the foot of a tree as if presented to something waiting in the darkness below. The sheriff's department took over the investigation. The camp was finally evacuated, the children bused to a staging area in town while their parents were contacted and arrangements were made for their return home. Margaret Chen gave statement after statement, answering questions she did not know how to answer, describing events she did not fully understand. She did not mention the Miwok stories. She did not mention the voices in the night. She told the investigators what they expected to hear: that a child had wandered into the forest, that a predator had attacked him, that the strange condition of the body was the result of animal scavenging, nothing more. She did not believe this. She knew the investigators did not believe it either. But what was the alternative? What could they possibly say? Sarah Mendez was the last child to leave Camp Evergreen that summer. Her parents arrived late, delayed by traffic and construction and all the mundane obstacles that had no right to exist in a world where children disappeared into forests and were found days later with their insides removed. Sarah waited in the main lodge with Rebecca Holt, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor, listening to the sounds of the forest through the open windows. The voices were still there, she told Rebecca. She could hear them even now, even in the daylight, even with the lodge full of people and activity and noise. They were calling to her. They were calling to everyone. They were hungry and they had tasted blood, and they would not stop until they had taken everything they wanted. Rebecca listened without interrupting. She had heard enough over the past weeks to know that Sarah was not simply imagining things, that something was happening at Camp Evergreen that exceeded the boundaries of rational explanation. When Sarah finished speaking, Rebecca asked her a question that had been forming in her mind since the discovery of Christopher's body. She asked Sarah what the voices were, what they belonged to, what was making the sounds that lured children into the darkness. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she did not know, not exactly, but she had dreamed about it. In her dreams, she had seen something vast and ancient moving through tunnels beneath the earth, something that had been there since before the trees, since before the mountains, since before anything that walked on two legs or looked up at the stars. It was old in a way that humans could not comprehend, old in a way that made centuries seem like seconds, old in a way that made the entire history of human civilization seem like a brief and insignificant flicker in the darkness. It had been sleeping for a long time, the thing in her dreams, but it was waking up now. It was waking up, and it was hungry, and it had learned how to call to the creatures that walked above it, how to speak in their voices, how to promise them things they wanted, how to lure them down into the places where no light had ever reached. Sarah's parents arrived an hour later. They bundled their daughter into their car and drove away without speaking to anyone, without asking questions, without looking back at the camp that had changed their daughter in ways they would never fully understand. Rebecca watched them go and then walked to the edge of the clearing and stood there, listening to the forest, wondering if she could hear what Sarah had heard, wondering if the voices would call to her too now that she knew they existed. She heard nothing but wind and birds and the distant rumble of thunder from a storm building over the mountains. But the silence felt wrong somehow, felt too complete, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Camp Evergreen was officially closed on July 3, 1984. The county cited safety concerns related to the ongoing investigation into Christopher Williams's death, but everyone understood that the camp would never reopen, that what had happened there had poisoned the land in a way that could not be undone. The buildings were locked and boarded. The gates were chained shut. Warning signs were posted along the perimeter fence, and the property was left to decay in peace, or what passed for peace in a place where children's voices still echoed through the trees on quiet nights. The investigation into Christopher's death was never resolved. The medical examiner's report, a document that Margaret Chen obtained through unofficial channels years later, described the removal of the boy's organs as inconsistent with any known predator behavior or human surgical technique. The incisions were too clean, too precise, too perfectly aligned with the body's natural anatomical divisions. There was no evidence of teeth marks or claw marks or any of the other signs that would indicate animal involvement. There was no evidence of human tool use either, no blade marks or saw marks or the characteristic striations left by medical instruments. The examiner concluded, reluctantly, that the cause of death could not be determined and that the removal of the organs could not be explained by any mechanism within his experience or understanding. The case file was closed in December 1984, marked as unsolved. Christopher Williams's parents buried an empty casket in a cemetery in Oakland, their son's organs never recovered, his true cause of death never discovered. The counselors and staff of Camp Evergreen scattered to other jobs, other lives, other summers that would never quite feel as real as that one. Most of them refused to speak about what they had experienced. A few wrote letters to each other over the years, sharing fragments of memory, comparing notes on dreams that all seemed to center on the same images: tunnels in the earth, voices in the darkness, something vast and patient waiting below. 3 years passed. The buildings of Camp Evergreen rotted and sagged. The trails grew over with brush and fallen branches. The lake filled with algae and debris, its surface turning from clear blue to murky green to the color of old blood. Animals avoided the property, a fact noted by several hunters who attempted to poach deer in the surrounding forest and found that their quarry would not enter the valley, would not cross an invisible boundary that seemed to correspond exactly with the old property lines. Douglas Trent patrolled the area when his duties required it, but he never stayed longer than necessary, never ventured off the main roads, never looked too closely at the shadows between the trees. Then Thomas Whitfield arrived. Thomas was a new ranger, transferred to the district in the spring of 1987 to replace a colleague who had retired after 30 years of service. He was young and eager and skeptical of the stories that circulated among the older rangers, stories about voices in the night and children who disappeared and a camp that had been closed because of things no one would talk about. He requested permission to conduct a survey of the abandoned property, arguing that the county needed accurate information about the condition of the buildings and the potential hazards they posed. His supervisor approved the request with evident reluctance, warning Thomas to be careful, to stay on the marked paths, to leave before dark and not to come back if anything seemed wrong. Thomas conducted his first survey on August 10, 1987. He spent 6 hours on the property, documenting the decay of the structures, photographing the damage caused by weather and neglect and the slow, inexorable pressure of the encroaching forest. He noted the strange silence of the place, the absence of the birds and insects that should have colonized the abandoned buildings, the way his footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should in the empty spaces. He found the sinkhole Douglas had discovered 3 years earlier, now expanded to perhaps 20 feet in diameter, its edges crumbling, its depths invisible in the perpetual shadow. He did not descend into it, but he stood at its rim for a long time, looking down, listening to sounds that might have been wind moving through underground passages or might have been something else entirely. His log from that day contains a single anomalous entry, written in handwriting that differs from his usual neat script, the letters cramped and hurried as if transcribed in a moment of urgent revelation. He wrote, "They know I am here. They are watching. They are waiting. They want me to come down." Thomas returned to Camp Evergreen on August 12. He returned again on August 13. Each time he stayed longer, ventured deeper, approached closer to the sinkhole that seemed to draw him like a magnet. His logs from these visits are fragmentary and confused, jumping between observations and speculations and passages that read like transcriptions of voices only he could hear. He wrote about children laughing in the forest. He wrote about a woman calling his name with his mother's voice, his mother who had been dead for 5 years. He wrote about tunnels and darkness and hunger and patience and something that had been waiting beneath the valley floor since before the first humans had walked the earth. On August 14, 1987, Thomas Whitfield drove to Camp Evergreen for the last time. He parked his truck at the main gate, stepped out and walked into the forest. His footprints led toward the sinkhole, growing fainter as they approached its edge, vanishing entirely at the crumbling rim. The search teams who came later found nothing. No body, no equipment, no sign of what had happened to him in the darkness below. They found only his truck at the gate, engine cold, keys dangling, door hanging open as if he had meant to return at any moment. He never did. The testimony of Rebecca Holt was recorded in October 1991, 7 years after the events at Camp Evergreen. She had agreed to speak with a journalist named Daniel Marsh, who was writing a book about unexplained disappearances in Northern California, after years of refusing all requests for interviews. She met him at a coffee shop in Sacramento, where she now worked as a social worker specializing in childhood trauma, and she told him everything she remembered, everything she had experienced, everything she had never been able to forget. She began with Sarah Mendez. She described the girl's quiet intensity, her way of listening to things no one else could hear, her journal entries that had documented the first signs of what would become a nightmare. She described the night she had heard the voices herself, the child's voice calling her name from the treeline, the overwhelming urge to follow it into the darkness, the terror that had seized her when she realized what she had almost done. She described the search for Christopher Williams, the discovery of his body, the evacuation of the camp, and the years of silence that followed, years during which she had told herself that what happened at Camp Evergreen was over, that closing the camp had been enough, that whatever lurked beneath the valley would be content to wait in its tunnels and leave the world above in peace. She had been wrong. The voices had followed her. They came to her in dreams at first, calling from somewhere deep underground, promising her things she had never known she wanted. Then they began to come while she was awake, intruding on her thoughts during quiet moments, whispering to her while she tried to work or eat or sleep. They knew her name. They knew her secrets. They knew the deepest fears she had never shared with anyone, and they used that knowledge to craft their calls, to shape their promises, to make her want to follow them even though she knew what waited at the end of the path they offered. Rebecca told Daniel that she had tried everything to make the voices stop. She had seen therapists and psychiatrists and taken medications that were supposed to silence the intrusive thoughts that plagued her. Nothing worked. The voices were not inside her head, she had finally realized. They were outside, somewhere in the real world, somewhere beneath the ground in a valley she had visited once and could never truly leave. They had touched her, tasted her, learned the shape of her mind during those weeks at Camp Evergreen, and now they would never let her go. They would call to her until she answered. They would wait for her until she came. The journalist asked Rebecca if she knew what the voices were, what was making them, what lived beneath Camp Evergreen. Rebecca was quiet for a long time before answering. She said she had done research over the years, had read everything she could find about the Miwok legends and the history of the valley and the strange events that had occurred there long before Harold Evergreen built his camp. She said she believed that something ancient lived in the caves and tunnels beneath the valley floor, something that predated human settlement by millions of years, something that had developed methods of hunting that no human science could explain. It lured its prey with sounds, with voices, with mimicry so perfect that even those who knew better could not resist its call. It consumed its victims in ways that left almost nothing behind, extracting what it needed and discarding what it did not. And it was patient, patient beyond any human capacity for waiting, patient enough to let years or decades or centuries pass between feedings, patient enough to wait for the right moment, the right prey, the right opportunity to emerge from its tunnels and take what it wanted from the world above. Rebecca told Daniel that she believed the thing beneath Camp Evergreen was getting stronger. The voices were louder now than they had been in 1984, clearer, more insistent. She heard them almost constantly, a chorus of children's voices mixed with adults, mixed with sounds that were not quite human, sounds that seemed to come from something trying to imitate speech without fully understanding what speech was. She believed that the creature, if it could be called a creature, was preparing for something, building towards some kind of emergence that would be far worse than anything that had happened at the camp. She did not know when this emergence would occur or what form it would take. She only knew that it was coming and that when it arrived no one would be safe. Daniel Marsh published his book in 1993. It received little attention, dismissed by reviewers as sensationalist pseudoscience, the work of a writer more interested in selling copies than uncovering truth. The chapter on Camp Evergreen was particularly criticized for its reliance on a single source, for its failure to provide corroborating evidence, for its conclusions that seemed to strain credulity beyond any reasonable limit. Daniel moved on to other projects, other stories, other disappearances that could be explained by more mundane causes. He never returned to the valley, never investigated further, never realized that the book he had written would become one of the only surviving records of what had happened there. Rebecca Holt died in 1997. Her body was found in her apartment in Sacramento, seated in a chair by the window, eyes open, expression peaceful. The coroner listed the cause of death as heart failure, unusual for a woman of 43 but not unprecedented. Her sister, who handled her affairs after her passing, found a journal among her belongings, pages filled with the same cramped, hurried handwriting that had characterized Thomas Whitfield's final logs. The journal documented Rebecca's ongoing experience of the voices, her efforts to resist their calls, her growing certainty that she would eventually fail. The final entry, dated 2 days before her death, contained a single sentence: "I am going to find them now." No one investigated the circumstances of her death. No one connected her passing to the events at Camp Evergreen, to the disappearances of Christopher Williams and Thomas Whitfield, to the ancient horror that continued to lurk beneath the valley floor. The world moved on, as it always does, and the secrets of Shawelo remained buried, waiting for the next generation of victims to stumble upon them. The sinkhole continued to expand. By 2001, it had grown to nearly 100 feet in diameter, swallowing trees and soil and anything else that ventured too close to its crumbling edge. The county sent engineers to assess the situation, and they returned with reports that described geological instabilities and underground water erosion and all the scientific explanations that could be summoned to account for a hole in the earth that should not have existed. They recommended stabilization measures that were never implemented, monitoring protocols that were never followed, evacuations of nearby properties that were never ordered. The sinkhole grew and the forest around it died, and the silence spread outward from Camp Evergreen like a stain on the land. In 2015, a group of urban explorers documented their visit to the abandoned camp in a series of YouTube videos that briefly attracted attention online. They filmed the decaying buildings, the overgrown trails, the lake that had become a swamp of murky water and rotting vegetation. They approached the sinkhole and peered over its edge, their flashlights unable to penetrate the darkness below. One of them, a young woman named Jessica Torres, reported hearing children's voices echoing up from the depths, and her companions laughed and called her imagination overactive. They left the camp that evening, posting their videos within the week, and thought nothing more of it. Jessica Torres disappeared 3 months later. She had been driving home from a friend's house late at night when she pulled over on a rural road, left her car running with the door open and walked into the forest. Her body was never found. The police investigated briefly and concluded that she had likely experienced some kind of mental health crisis, that she had wandered into the wilderness in a confused state and succumbed to exposure or accident. Her family accepted this explanation because there was no other explanation to accept. They buried an empty casket, just as Christopher Williams's parents had done 30 years earlier, and tried to move forward with lives that would never be quite whole again. The pattern continued, though no one was watching closely enough to see it. People who visited Camp Evergreen, or even drove past it on the highway that skirted the valley's edge, sometimes heard voices in the weeks and months that followed. Most dismissed the experience as imagination, as stress, as the product of minds seeking patterns and random noise. A few did not. A few followed the voices into dark places, into tunnels and caves and sinkholes, into the waiting embrace of something that had been hungry for a very long time. Their disappearances were scattered and disconnected, separated by geography and time and the ordinary chaos of human life. No one connected them. No one saw the thread that linked them all back to a valley in Northern California where something ancient stirred beneath the earth. Margaret Chen died in 2019 at the age of 83, in a nursing home in Portland. She had never spoken publicly about Camp Evergreen, had never responded to the occasional journalist who sought her out for comments on the anniversary of Christopher Williams's death or the publication of Daniel Marsh's book. But she had kept records, documents and photographs and transcripts of conversations that she had hidden away in a safety deposit box, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to understand. Her granddaughter discovered the box after her death and spent weeks going through its contents, piecing together a story that seemed impossible and yet was supported by evidence she could not dismiss. The granddaughter, whose name was Elena Chen, was a graduate student in anthropology at Berkeley. She had the training to evaluate the documents her grandmother had preserved, to assess the Miwok oral histories and the ranger logs and the testimonies of counselors and staff. She had the skills to research the disappearances that had occurred in the decades since Camp Evergreen's closure, to map them against the geography of the valley, to trace the expanding circle of influence that seemed to radiate outward from the sinkhole at its center. And she had the courage to ask questions that others had been afraid to ask, to seek answers that others had been afraid to find. What Elena discovered terrified her. The disappearances were not random. They followed a pattern, a spiral that began at Camp Evergreen and wound outward through the surrounding region, claiming victims at intervals that corresponded to some kind of cycle she could not quite identify. The victims were not chosen at random either. They were people who had visited the valley, or who had relatives who had visited, or who had been touched in some way by the thing that lurked beneath it. It was as if the creature, and Elena could not bring herself to call it anything else, was tracking its prey across generations, reaching out through time and space to claim the descendants of those it had failed to consume decades earlier. Elena began to write a thesis on her findings. She never finished it. The events of October 2023 would later be described as a catastrophic geological incident, a collapse of the valley floor that claimed multiple lives and required the permanent evacuation of the surrounding area. The official reports made no mention of the sounds that survivors described hearing in the hours before the collapse, sounds like children laughing and crying and calling for help. They made no mention of the figures that witnesses claimed to have seen emerging from the sinkhole, figures that were not quite human, figures that moved with a terrible grace through the chaos of falling earth and splintering trees. They made no mention of the thing that rose from the depths when the collapse was complete, the thing that Elena Chen saw in her final moments, the thing that had been waiting beneath Camp Evergreen for longer than humanity had existed. Elena had returned to the valley 3 days before the collapse. She had driven through the night from Berkeley, her grandmother's documents spread across the passenger seat, her mind racing with theories and fears and a desperate need to understand what she was facing. She parked at the old camp gate, now rusted and sagging on broken hinges, and walked into the forest as Thomas Whitfield had walked 36 years earlier. She did not know that she was following in his footsteps. She did not know that she was walking the same path that Christopher Williams and Rebecca Holt and Jessica Torres and dozens of others had walked before her. She knew only that she needed to see the sinkhole for herself, needed to confirm what her research had suggested, needed to confront the horror that had haunted her family for nearly 4 decades. The forest was silent as she walked. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. No wind stirred the branches overhead. The only sound was her own breathing, her own footsteps, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then, slowly, other sounds began to emerge from the silence. Children's voices, distant at first, then closer, calling her name in tones that were almost familiar, almost recognizable, almost human. She heard her mother's voice among them, her mother who had died when Elena was 12, her mother who had never been to Camp Evergreen, her mother whose voice the thing in the ground could not possibly have known. But it did know. It had learned, over years and decades and centuries, how to reach into the minds of its prey and extract the sounds that would draw them forward, the voices that would make them want to follow, the promises that would make them forget everything they knew about danger and caution and survival. Elena stopped at the edge of the sinkhole. It had grown since the photographs in her grandmother's documents, grown until it was perhaps 200 feet across, a vast wound in the earth that seemed to descend forever into darkness. She stood there for a long time, listening to the voices that rose from below, watching the shadows that moved in ways shadows should not move. She thought about turning back, about returning to her car and driving away and leaving the valley to its secrets. But she knew that would not save her. The thing had touched her now, just as it had touched her grandmother, just as it had touched everyone who came to this place. It would follow her wherever she went. It would call to her until she answered. It would wait for her until she came. So she descended. The walls of the sinkhole were not stone, she discovered, but something else, something organic and warm and pulsing with a rhythm that might have been breathing or might have been the movement of blood through vessels too vast to comprehend. The darkness was absolute, deeper than any darkness she had ever experienced, a darkness that seemed to have weight and texture and intention. She climbed down using roots and protrusions that seemed almost deliberately placed, almost designed to guide her deeper, almost eager to welcome her into the depths. The voices grew louder as she descended, clearer, more insistent. They were not speaking words anymore, not making sounds that could be called language. They were making sounds that reached directly into her brain and communicated meaning without the intermediary of language, meaning that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to the parts of her that existed before language, before civilization, before humanity itself. She understood, in that moment, what the thing beneath Camp Evergreen truly was. It was not a creature in any sense she could have comprehended. It was not a predator, though it consumed flesh. It was not a demon, though it was older than any human religion. It was something that existed outside the categories humans used to understand the world, something that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with biology or physics or the laws that governed ordinary existence. It was a hunger given form, a patience given substance, a darkness that had learned to wear the shapes of the things it consumed. It had been there since the beginning, since before the beginning, since before there was a world for it to wait beneath. And it would be there at the end, when the last stars burned out and the last light faded and the universe itself grew cold and silent and dark. The collapse began at 3:47 a.m. on October 17, 2023. Seismographs as far away as San Francisco registered the event, a sudden, catastrophic failure of the valley floor that sent shockwaves rippling through the surrounding region. The sinkhole expanded in seconds, swallowing acres of forest, consuming the ruins of Camp Evergreen, obliterating any evidence that the camp had ever existed. Emergency services responded within the hour, but there was nothing they could do. The valley had become a crater, a wound in the earth perhaps a mile across and so deep that no measurement could find its bottom. Smoke and dust rose from its depths, along with other things, sounds that the rescuers would later describe as mechanical or natural or anything other than what they truly were. The voices of every victim the thing had ever claimed, every child and adult and creature it had consumed over the eons of its existence, all of them calling out together in a chorus of hunger and longing and terrible, patient triumph. 17 people died in the collapse, according to official records. Most were emergency responders caught in secondary cave-ins as they attempted to approach the crater's edge. A few were residents of nearby properties who failed to evacuate in time. Elena Chen was listed among the missing, her car found at the old camp gate, her fate unknown. The area was cordoned off, declared unsafe for human habitation, surrounded by fences and warning signs that would rust and fade just as the previous warnings had rusted and faded. Scientists studied the crater from a distance, proposed theories about underground rivers and geological faults and all the explanations that allowed them to avoid confronting what they had truly witnessed. None of them descended into the depths. None of them wanted to know what waited there. But the voices did not stop. They spread outward from the crater, carried on frequencies that human instruments could not detect, reaching into dreams and quiet moments and the spaces between thoughts. People across Northern California began to report hearing children calling their names. A few followed the calls into dark places and did not return. Most resisted, dismissed the experiences as stress or imagination, went about their lives without understanding that something had changed, that something had awakened, that something was hungry and patient and reaching out into the world above. The Miwok had been right. The settlers had been wrong. The place where the earth swallows had opened its mouth at last, and it would not close again until it had consumed everything that walked above it. In the years since the collapse, the crater at Camp Evergreen has continued to expand. Slowly, imperceptibly, it grows, claiming inches and feet and yards of the surrounding forest with each passing season. The fence around it has been moved back 3 times, each time with less urgency, each time with more resignation. The people who lived nearby have moved away, driven by dreams they cannot explain and feelings of dread they cannot articulate. The roads that once passed through the valley have been closed, rerouted, forgotten. Maps no longer show the area at all, as if cartographers have collectively agreed to pretend it does not exist. But it does exist. And something lives there still, something that has been waiting since before the world had a name, something that will continue to wait until the world itself is gone. It has learned new voices now, voices from the collapse, voices from the investigators who studied its crater, voices from the scientists who analyzed its depths. It has learned Elena Chen's voice and her grandmother's voice, and the voices of everyone who ever sought to understand it. It knows their names. It knows their secrets. It knows the sounds that will draw them forward, the promises that will make them follow, the calls they will not be able to resist. And late at night, in the dreams of those who live within reach of its hunger, it whispers. It whispers that the children are waiting. It whispers that the children want to play. It whispers that if you listen closely, if you follow the voices into the darkness, you can be with them forever. All you have to do is come down. All you have to do is find them. All you have to do is let go. The voices are so very sweet. The children sound so very sad. And beneath Camp Evergreen, in tunnels that have never known light, something vast and ancient shifts in its sleep, dreaming of the feast to come, patient as stone, hungry as time. Waiting. Always waiting.